Turn them off for a moment of silence. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated.
Councilmember Clark.
Here.
Reed.
Here.
Brown.
Here.
Lawler.
Here.
Spicer.
Here.
Williamson. And Mayor Atchison.
Here. And I will comment that Councilmember Spicer notified me he got a late start from.
No.
What did I say, Spicer? I'm so sorry. I have a bad head cold today, so yes, Williamson. He got a late start from Chelsea, and he expects to be 5 minutes late. 10 minutes, something like that. So we'll go into there are no public hearings or public comments. Anybody that wishes to make a public comment, please come forward, state your name and address for the record. Address your comments to the council in no more than 3 minutes. Seeing no public comments, we can close that. Okay. I apologize, I skipped over approval of the agenda. May I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Seconded?
Second.
Okay, it's moved and second. All those in favor of approving the agenda as is, say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Those opposed? Okay, the agenda is approved. The first item for individual discussion is council training and welcome Attorney Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have handed out to you a package of documents that includes an outline. Those of you who were here the last time, the outline is very similar. It's been updated a little bit with updated references to your new rules as updated. And I've also included a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, a copy of the updated rules, and a copy of your city charter. I will not, the PowerPoint presentation cross-references the outline. And I would have redated the handouts, but I had them ready for the last time when we got snowed out, and I decided that we would avoid a tree kill by just using the handouts as they are. Some of you know me. For those of you who don't, a little bit of background might be helpful. I graduated from the University of Michigan Law School in 1980. Since that time, I've done nothing but municipal law. Until July, I worked at a number of different law firms, most recently Dickinson Wright, which is about a 500-member law firm with 19 offices across the country and in Canada. And during the course of my practice, I've worked with at least 40 different Michigan local governments and as many DDAs and TIFAs and LDFAs, emergency services authorities, utility authorities, and so forth. I've worked with the legislature on a number of issues. I authored the Municipal Partnership Act, worked on a number of the other intergovernmental cooperation statutes. I was part of Lieutenant Governor Calley's personal property tax working group and worked on that legislation for about 2.5 years. And I worked on changes to the Brownfield Act, the Uniform Condemnation Procedures Act, the recent TIF consolidation bill, the Tax Increment Financing Consolidation Bill that's about 400 pages long, and so forth. Been married 37 years. I have 2 children, both of whom married wives that were above them. And I now have 6 grandchildren, 2.5 and under. So that's a little bit about me, so you understand where I'm coming from. During the course of my practice, I'm now the in-house city attorney for the city of Wyoming, position I took in July. During the course of my practice, I've seen a lot of things. I've seen councils ignore the embezzlement of a city or of a manager, village manager, and ignore his criminal activity because they liked his family. I've seen staff so fearful of councils that they won't come to council meetings or are looking for other jobs. I saw one commissioner pick up a pitcher of water, walk down to the other end of the dais, pour it over another commissioner and say, "That'll cool you off." And I've seen an orchestrated demonstration of college students who came in and disrupted a meeting and all laid down on the floor and refused to leave, so the mayor just adjourned the meeting. I've seen council spend 45 minutes discussing how to save $20 on a paper order, and then right after that, spend less than a minute approving millions of dollars worth of bonds. So I've seen a lot. Let me go to the next slide. Let's see. Context for city government. The concept is one of hierarchy of authority. So we've got the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution reserves certain rights to the states. The Michigan Constitution, first the 1907 Constitution, then the Constitution of 1963 preserves home rule for cities. Now, home rule was intended to limit state government. And so we've got this hierarchy, the United States Constitution, the Michigan Constitution, then the Michigan statutes, then your charter, which is essentially the Constitution for the city, and then your city ordinances and resolutions. But even with home rule, some things require statutory authority. So in Michigan, you only have the taxing power that's expressly granted by state statute. You don't have any other taxing power. That means for local governments, you're limited basically to property tax and an income tax. You can't issue debt or borrow money except with statutory authority and in accordance with that statutory authority. So a local government can't simply run down to the bank and take out a mortgage or get a signature loan. You have to issue bonds and comply with the Municipal Finance Act and other statutes in borrowing any money. Zoning is an area of law where you're only able to do what you're statutorily authorized to do. And much of election law is the same way now. The state has preempted local control over elections, so you can only hold elections at specific times that the state allows for those. Currently, February, May, August, and November. Used to be we could hold special elections on 60 or 90 days notice. In fact, a lot of charters still have those kinds of provisions in them. Home rule is also something that's good in concept, but the legislature keeps eroding home rule. So, and the courts have too. There's a Lansing pipeline case, and even though the Constitution of the state contains a provision that says that any pipeline or utility line requires a local franchise, the Michigan Supreme Court essentially read that provision out of the state constitution, and in a pipeline going through the city of Lansing, a high-pressure gas line, they said the city had no local control. You're familiar with the statutes regarding weapons, firearms, and most of those have preempted local control over that issue. Adult foster care homes, local control is preempted. Child care homes, local control is preempted. You can't have living wage ordinances. You have very little regulation over wetlands. There are rights to farm acts. The state construction code used to be every local government had their own construction code, and the state preempted all of that. Recently, we had the small cell legislation that was passed that basically removes local control over the placement of small cellular towers and so forth, and you can't keep them out of your rights of way, and so forth. Now, there are several types of local governments. There's a town hall form of local government and a town hall form of local government. Yes, ma'am.
Can I stop you?
Sure.
And ask a quick question? Attorney Smith, does the Home Rule Act or any state law or charter, our charter, prevent a city from, we get homes by forfeiture, from basically gutting, renovating, and then reselling those homes? Is there something that prevents that?
You mean, can the city,
Be in the business of,
some cities do some of that. Most cities use a land bank authority, because the land bank authority can more easily clear title, and or they use a housing commission, or they will transfer it to a nonprofit entity like Habitat for Humanity. Most of them set up other ways to do it because cities really aren't in a very good position to act as property owners and to manage the rehabilitation and renovation of homes.
so if that were to happen, they were to establish an entity to do that, then could, once that dwelling is sold, then could the money then be for, basically returned to the city, or?
Well, you'd have to pay off, most of the profits on that would go to pay off the back taxes, assuming it was a tax foreclosure. And yes, you theoretically could use it for other purposes.
Thank you.
There are several types of local government. So we've got a town hall form of local government. Michigan townships are a form of that. Many townships still have an annual township meeting where all of the electors are invited in and get to vote on various issues. But a town hall form of government is really what's used in a lot of towns on the East Coast, particularly the New England states. And that's where the people, the electors, come in and vote on the annual budget. They vote on all kinds of other things. And the elected body has limited control. There's a commission form of government. Counties are a commission form of government. And in a commission form of government, you've got the administrative responsibilities and the legislative responsibilities in the same body. So of the 83 counties in Michigan, 78 or 79 are commission forms of government, and you've got some exceptions from that. Oakland County is a uniform form of government. Wayne and Macomb counties have an elected executive. They're charter counties, and so they operate a little differently. But a commission form of government has the elected body also administers the government. And then you've got a strong mayor or strong executive form of government, and there are a couple of different varieties on that. In some cases, the mayor is a strong mayor and is a part of the legislative body and votes as a member of the legislative body. The city of Kentwood is set up in that fashion. The mayor's a member of the city commission, votes as part of the city commission, presides over the city commission, and does not have a veto. You've got other situations like the city of Dearborn, the city of Lansing, the city of Detroit, where the mayor's not part of the government. The council has its own elected head. There's a council chair or council president who presides over the council, and the mayor is elected. That's more akin to what we have with the governor and the legislature and so forth. In those cases, the mayor has some veto authority. And then you've got a commission or council manager form of government, and in that case, you've got a form of government where the policy and the legislative authority is in the elected body, and then the management, the administrative authority, is in a city manager who's hired by and is accountable to that body. And that's the form of government that the city of Albion has, is a council manager form of government. The roles and responsibilities of city officials are set in large part by the basic concept underlying your form of government. So if you've got a council manager form of government, you've got kind of bifurcated authority, right? You've got a legislative body on the one side that sets policy, that holds the appointed executive or appointed administrative officer accountable, and then you've got the day-to-day operation of the government that sits under the leadership of that appointed administrative person. And the city manager in that form of government is the chief administrative officer. The council is the policy-making and legislative body, and the mayor is a voting member and presiding officer of the council. Now, let's see. Council manager. Okay. Mayor. The mayor is the ceremonial head of the city. The chief executive officer has an equal voice and duty to vote as a council member. He's the presiding officer of the council, advises the council on public affairs of the city, generally appoints with council consent members of boards and other bodies, and the mayor under state law has certain emergency powers. I'm missing a slide here. Okay, I'm missing the slide on the city manager, which you'll find in your packet as slide 4. The city manager serves at the pleasure of the council.
Attorneys.
Yes.
Before we get on to the manager, the chief executive officer role under mayor, could you expand some on that, what that looks like versus not what it doesn't look like?
Well, I think if I go through the city manager powers and duties, then I can contrast that with the mayor, and that might be the best way to do it, because the duties lie in one place or another. So the city manager serves at the pleasure of the council, administers and supervises the administrative departments. All officers and employees except council members and the city attorney are accountable to the city manager. The city manager administers the annual budget, prepares with the clerk the agendas, and attends council meetings, recommends adoptions of measures the manager deems necessary, enforces ordinance, and generally there's a whole list of powers under your charter that the manager has. The mayor, in contrast, is a chief executive officer but doesn't have any administrative powers. So over the day-to-day operation of the city, the mayor has very little authority. The mayor works in collaboration with the manager, should work in frequent communication with the manager. The mayor should be the person who gathers and tries to build council consensus. The mayor should make it so that the manager can do her or his job in a way as unencumbered by politics as possible. That is, the mayor should be the link between the manager and the council to avoid the politics and avoid having the manager have to play the politics. And the manager should rely on the mayor to count and marshal the council votes versus the manager having to do that. Okay? Ideally, that's how it works. And
Sir, you just said that the mayor should be the link, like the liaison, spokesman for the council, the go-between, collaborate with the manager.
right. So the manager should be able to come to the mayor and say, well, Mayor, how do you see the council breaking down on this issue? Do you see this as something the council is going to want to listen to? Is it something that should go on the agenda or we should wait? And in a good, well-functioning council manager form of government, the mayor serves that role. Now, having said that, I've worked in a number of communities where that doesn't work, either because the mayor doesn't put in that kind of time, doesn't have those kinds of leadership and communication skills, whatever it might be. Sure. Because I'm moving too much, right? I have a see if this will work. There we go. Now, the council acts as a body. As individual council members, you don't have any individual authority. In Chicago, aldermen have some authority within their council districts. Okay, so aldermen have offices within their districts, and they have budgets to expend, and they can influence how public works are accomplished and other things within their districts. But that doesn't occur under a council manager form of government. The council acts as a body through its ordinances, resolutions, and motions, through adopting budgets and approving contracts and other kinds of things. The council as a body adopts legislation, ordinances and resolutions. As a body, it gives direction. As a body, it adopts policy. Okay? Individual council members don't have that authority. Now, council members under your charter are to work with the administrative staff through the mayor or through the manager's office. That's true under most city manager, council manager forms of government. You communicate with the administrative staff and the rest of the staff through the manager's office. Why is that the case? Well, that's the case for a number of reasons. First of all, your staff can only take direction from one person. The staff shouldn't be in a position of having to choose which council member's direction or whether to listen to the council or listen to the manager. There needs to be a stated chain of authority, and the staff needs to be able to count on who to take direction from. Secondly, the manager is likely to understand more than any individual council member the immediate needs of the community, the short-term needs and direction of the community, and the longer-term direction of the community. And the manager's likely to have more information as to what's going on in the city on a day-to-day basis than any individual council member's going to have. More than that, as I said before, because the council acts as a body, individual council members shouldn't be trying to give that direction, because it's only the body as a whole that can give that direction, not individual council members. And finally, I've worked with communities where one or more council members from time to time just want to stop in the DPW garage and share a cup of coffee and so forth. But that's very disruptive to the operations in that office or that garage or wherever it might be occurring, because then folks feel like they have to stop what they're doing and pay attention to the council member. After all, the council member sets their budgets, approves their paychecks, and so forth, right? Good managers, however, make sure that the council is always informed. A manager's worst nightmare is for a council member to first hear about something from another council member or from the media, right? So a good manager will make sure that all council members have the same information. Good managers communicate with the council as a whole on a regular basis. In most communities, the manager sends out a weekly letter or weekly memo or weekly email to the council as a whole and updates the council on what's going on. Sometimes that information is very specific and lengthy. Sometimes it's just to say, we had a citizen in here who was concerned about snow plowing. This is what we told them. If you hear from him, please refer them back to me and I'll follow up. Or if you hear more complaints from people on this street, let me know and I'll do some more follow-up, whatever it might be. Good councils have good dialogue with the managers, either directly or through the mayor. So good councils will let the manager know what priorities are and annually set very specific priorities and goals that are objective in that there are criteria that can be applied to determine whether that goal's been met. So you can't simply say, improve the quality of roads in the city. And instead, a better way to do that is to say, we want First Street, State Street, and Maple Street repaved in the next 2 years. Or find a way to get sidewalks put in on on stated other streets. You can't just say improve walkability of the community. There should be specific measurable goals to hold a manager and your administrative team to. Good mayors build council consensus, as I said, share council concerns, and work with the manager on council communications. So a good mayor will periodically hear from council members, reach out to council members, understand what concerns are, what individual council members' priorities might be, get a feel for what the council wants to do, and be communicating with the manager, and at the same time take the manager's concerns and communicate back to individual council members. If there's a particular council member who's acting inappropriately during council meetings, the mayor will have conversations with that council member and try to bring the council member back into the fold and acting in accordance with good council practices. Your council procedures are really elaborate. And that's good in some ways because you have a number of procedural rules that don't have you relying on Robert's Rules of Order, which can be very difficult for people to follow. And you have a document you can go to that tells you how you're going to do some things. Generally, a few overviews are good here. Council meetings are to conduct the public business before the public, in the presence of the public. Their business meetings intended to address items on the agenda. It's not a town hall form of government, so you don't have any obligation to allow citizens to weigh in on every issue. You have an obligation to allow citizens an opportunity to speak to the council at each meeting. But that comes from the concept that citizens have a right to petition their government. It doesn't require that you respond or that you engage in debate or that you do other kinds of things. Council members in a well-run meeting will address their comments to one another or to the mayor and stay on topic. Personal comments or personal attacks are out of order, whether they're by council members or whether they're by the members of the public. They're inappropriate in a meeting. Your rules say that council members aren't to speak more than twice until all others have had a chance, and your comments are to be generally limited to 10 minutes. Public comments are limited to 3 minutes at the beginning and end of the meeting and at public hearings. And audience applause or cheering is always out of order, with the exception of when somebody gets an award or something, or they're retiring. It might be appropriate for everybody to applaud that milestone in somebody's life. Open government. You're familiar with the Open Meetings Act. It requires all meetings to be open to the public. You can have closed sessions for very specific purposes, And you have to, within that closed session, keep your discussion within the purpose of the closed session. You're familiar with the Freedom of Information Act, and you're familiar with records retention requirements. With limited exceptions, if it involves city business, it is public. The exceptions all get very narrowly construed, and every time the Court of Appeals comes down with another Freedom of Information Act decision or another Open Meetings Act decision, it's tended to construe the exceptions even more narrowly than before. Generally, the exceptions apply only when the public, that is, persons outside of government, benefit from the exemption, so it protects the public's interest. So obviously, if you're about to buy real estate and you're discussing what kind of offer you're going to make for that, the public's interest isn't advanced if you have a public discussion of it, because then the other party knows what you're willing to spend, right? Or key terms of that. Same thing in labor negotiations. Obviously, discussing your negotiation strategy in an open session would be detrimental to the public interest. Or if you've got pending litigation and you need to consult with your attorney about it, or if you've got an opinion from your attorney on a legal issue, you wouldn't want the attorney to say publicly, well, I'm afraid of this, this, and this, and we might have goofed up here. That could create you just don't want those kinds of discussions in the public. So in those cases where the public interest is better protected by the privacy, you have closed session possibilities. Electronic communications related to city business, even if they're on personal devices, are subject to required retention and disclosure. So if you've got a personal device and you're on your personal email account, see Hillary Clinton, and you're emailing, that's all subject to the retention requirements because you're emailing on city business, so that record has to be retained, and it's subject to a Freedom of Information Act inquiry and so forth. Text. If you're texting on city business from your personal device, the same way. That's why now that I'm an in-house government official, I carry two phones, right? My personal phone for all of the stuff that's non-governmental, and then my city-issued phone that carries all of the emails, text, phone logs, and other things related to city business. When doing the public's business, you should assume that it's public, and at the same token, you should assume that any time as a council member you're out in the community, people are going to see you as a council member, and you should assume that at any time you may be recorded or videoed. See Mitt Romney, just to know that it's both sides of the aisle that have those issues. And recently we've had groups of people doing what they call First Amendment audits, and they'll go out to a DPW job site or an incident where the police are taking some action and begin recording and so forth in an effort to try to elicit some response or intemperate comments from public officials. Sometimes they'll do that at a meeting like this. Sometimes they'll walk into a city hall or other building and begin filming. Sometimes they even attempt to get back in other kinds of non-public areas. So you should assume that you're going to be challenged. Best practices. As a city official, people perceive you as its representative, whether you're at the grocery store or at church or the library, at Meyer or someplace else. If they know that you're a city official, they're going to perceive you as a city official, regardless of where you are and what you're doing. When asked, it's important that you support city policies, that you support city personnel and you support city practices while appropriately ensuring accountability and, when needed, seeking changes. I'm going to move that down just a little bit. Praise publicly, criticize privately to the extent you can. Evaluate based on concrete goals, outcomes, and measurements. For day-to-day matters, refer people to appropriate staff. If you get a call that somebody's upset about their snow plowing, and we have some hypotheticals coming up here, refer the person to the city manager who can then try to deal with that issue. Everybody on the council gets the same information. So if you're emailing an inquiry to the city manager, anticipate that in response to that inquiry, the city manager will copy all council members with the original inquiry and with the response, because all council members should have the same information. Why? Because you get better decisions that way if everybody has the same information to act upon. And you avoid the situation where somebody has an unfair advantage in trying to make or influence the policy. Council members advocate for policies, not for people or entities, and avoid promise making regarding official action. As I said, the council acts as a body, so you can advocate about policy. You can advocate about whether or not to approve a contract. You can advocate about what's in the best interest of the city, but you shouldn't be making promises to any individuals that council's going to do this, or you'll see that that gets done, or you'll make sure staff does something or other. You can advocate, but you can't promise. The council and manager should act with mutual respect and, to the extent possible, make the management non-political. There will be times when you won't be unanimous in your policy making, right? You'll be split. And regardless of the outcome, once the majority makes a decision, that's the policy. And that's what the manager is obligated to follow, no matter how steadfastly or how vehemently or how strongly the minority council members might feel about that policy. The manager acts with the guidance given by a majority of the body, and that's what the manager's obligated to do as long as it's in accordance with applicable law. And if it's not in accordance with applicable law, your city attorney will stand up and down and wave you off, or do something else to make sure that that doesn't happen. Spokespersons, who's ever designated as a spokesperson, and for the most part it's the mayor, because the mayor under the charter is given that role as a spokesperson for the council, but on occasion the council may designate somebody else to be a spokesperson. You may be appointed to be a liaison to some committee or some group and be the spokesperson for the city with respect to that group. You need to make sure that when you're speaking, that you're speaking from what a majority of the council has given guidance on, and not interjecting your personal opinion as the city opinion or position or the position of the council. And as I said, you should be cautious with electronic communication and assume anything and everything may be recorded. As I find a saying, if you don't want it splashed across the front page of the Free Press, don't say it. Right? If it's going to embarrass you to have that, then don't say it. Okay. Some hypotheticals, and this will allow us to talk about some other things. Hypothetical number one, we've already talked about this. A citizen seeks change in snow plowing. Maybe the snow plows go too fast. In my first house, the speed limit on the road was 25 miles an hour. The plows went at 45, and it blew the snow halfway up the driveway I just cleared. It didn't just end up in the apron, so I called the city at one time to ask them to do something different. Somebody might want the snow piled differently. In a lot of cul-de-sacs, after the polar vortex, there was some concern about the size of the snow piles in the cul-de-sac because it was blocking some people from getting in their driveways. Some want it to be plowed earlier or later. They're too frequent, not frequent enough, too much salt, too little salt. You get the idea. You've probably heard all of them. How do you deal with it?
Refer them all to the city manager.
Yeah. Generally, that's the way to do it. I understand your concern. I can empathize with your problems. Please call the city manager. Get back to me if you're not satisfied, or I will also follow up with the city manager and ask her to get back with me and report on how this issue was addressed. If there are a number of concerns, let's say you've got a concern from the school district that certain key school routes aren't getting plowed and you get those concerns repeatedly, you might, as a body, bring that up with the city manager and say, is there some way we can address this because it seems to be a larger concern. A business wants assurance of a city contract. Sometimes it's a general kind of thing. The city should buy local. The city is getting a bad deal. Her business performs better. Other businesses unfairly compete. Longer-term contracts better, so forth and so on. You get the gist. How do you deal with it? Yeah, this one, same answer, but it's important to support the city policies on the way, right? So a good response might be, thank you for your interest. We want to make sure everybody's fairly dealt with, and our policies are to ensure that we get the best pricing and so forth, and they're to ensure that all possible vendors are treated fairly and the same. If your name's not on our list, please contact the city manager and make sure your name gets on the list so next time there's an RFP or something, we can make sure you get one. I will refer, if there are policy questions like should you have a local preference, should you have a Buy American or Buy Michigan preference, should you have certain other kinds of preferences or changes in policy, then you can say, I'll bring that up to the council and we can discuss that in our policy-making session at the appropriate time. Concerns about police conduct. Too many, too few patrols. There was excessive force in a situation. Officers were discourteous, disrespectful. They're quick-tempered, whatever it might be. How do you deal with it? Yeah. Well, in good part, that's how you would do it. But again, it's important to support your staff and the city policy. So say, I'm glad you brought this to my attention. We expect our law enforcement professionals to act professionally and to act courteously and to act without bias, treating everybody the same. We also want them to be effective and produce good results. We want citizens to feel safe and secure. So the council doesn't oversee that particular department, isn't involved in departmental policies and procedures, but please let me refer your concern to the city manager. I'll have the city manager get back to you after she's looked into this incident. So you have the backs of your department. You're not prejudging anything, and you need to be careful about that because there are two sides to every story. And having looked at police videos a lot over the years, and more recently body cams, in 98% of the cases, they support the officer's version of what's going on. Not always, and there are times when even the best officers goof up and are bad-tempered or say things that are ill-advised or do other kinds of things. I've seen a lot of that over the years as well, and that's fine, but it's important to generally support your department and the people that are out there. That's true of officers, DPW workers, parks workers, whomever it might be. Staff member wants to know if she can count on you. Perhaps they're a union representative, perhaps they want you to help them resolve a grievance in a certain way, maybe they want changes in the contract to change certain benefits, maybe they're seeking assurances against layoffs, maybe they want to propose an early retirement buyout. How do you deal with it? Generally, it's best not to, but again, you can say, look, if you've got a policy concern as to whether we ought to change our personnel policies and so forth, why don't you put your concerns in writing to me and what you're proposing, and I can then get that to the mayor, the manager, and the council, and we can have a policy discussion on that issue. If it's how a particular personnel matter is handled, the council doesn't get involved in individual personnel matters. That's entirely within the administrative end of the city government. That's entirely the city manager's bailiwick. You should contact the city manager with particular concerns. Public comment includes personal attacks, perhaps against the city manager or staff member, maybe against another council member, maybe against a member of the audience. I've seen that where people have turned around and pointed fingers and even shaken fists at audience members. How do you respond? Yeah. Who's ever sitting in that seat should be hitting the gavel and ruling those comments out of order. Even if the allegations are serious and perhaps true, they're out of order in a council meeting. So I think what you can say is rule them out of order, acknowledge you obviously have serious concerns, you obviously feel pretty strongly about this, you're taking them seriously, but they're out of order here. It's not appropriate discussion in a council meeting. And it also may be problematic for you and the council if you're making certain kinds of allegations publicly. So to avoid problems for you and the council, what I'd like you to do is talk with the city manager or the police chief or whomever might be appropriate, or the city attorney, and then we will ask that person to get back to us and report what the result of their handling, what they found after looking into it. You've got concerns about a closed session. Sometimes I've had council members who are concerned that a closed session violated the Open Meetings Act because the discussion went beyond the scope of the announced purpose of the meeting, of the closed session, or because the topic isn't one that can be discussed in a closed session, they think. Whatever. Sometimes it's because, regardless of whether it can be discussed in the closed session, they think it's of such public interest that it ought to be discussed publicly. Perhaps they thought that some of the statements made in the closed sessions, sometimes closed session statements get rather candid. They might think that they were out of bounds and not very civil. Sometimes they question whether the information was accurate and complete. what do you do about a closed session that you think is run amok?
After the fact or during the fact?
Well, during the fact, if you think it's that way during the fact and the attorney's sitting there, you can ask the attorney for an opinion during the closed session. You know, are we staying within the bounds of where we have to be here? Is this all permitted? And so forth.
And after the fact, the same thing.
After the fact, the same thing. And if you're still not satisfied with the attorney's opinion, ask for permission to get an outside legal opinion. You know, Cullen can direct probably doesn't know more than 4 or 5 dozen other municipal attorneys across the state and could ask somebody to provide an independent opinion. But you can't disclose the contents of what was discussed in a closed session absent an order from a court. Okay? And
What if it happens? What
if somebody discloses what occurs in the closed session,
is?
my personal view is that that's miss or malfeasance in office, and the person could be dealt with accordingly. Okay? I don't know if Cullen shares that view or not, but you know, you're obligated to follow the law as a council member, and the decisions and the policies of the council as a whole. And if the council's decided this is an appropriate closed session discussion, then you shouldn't be disclosing it. If you are, it's probably miss or malfeasance in office. And by the way, that means you can't discuss it with anybody, not your spouse, not your best friend, not at the coffee shop or the bar.
Not another council member?
You can discuss it with other council members, and if there's a council member absent, you can certainly share with that council member what occurred during that closed session, because the council member was entitled to be there, but you can't discuss it with anybody else who wasn't present at the closed session. So if the clerk was present at the closed session and there were questions about it or questions about the minutes, you can get back to the clerk on that. Number 7, a developer seeks your full support for the project, wants help with zoning approvals, wants lower utility rates. It could be any variety of things. They want an easement across city property, whatever it might be. How do you deal with it?
Well, you can't commit to giving full support to what you don't, what
Right.
is included and it all entails. So
Right.
you wouldn't do that. Yes, sir.
Right. And I'm working now in a community where a particular developer keeps trying to run around behind the staff and go direct dial 1-800 council member and get support for various things. And there are at least one council member who tends to listen. And that's generally not a good thing. So city policies are intended to assure that all developers, property owners, and projects are treated similarly, right? Similar projects, similar property owners. That's why we have zoning. That's why we have the procedures in zoning with public hearing, and everybody's required to submit the same kinds of materials. That's why if we're selling city property, we generally do it on a bid basis, or we have kind of an open process for doing that. That's why a lot of other things are open and dynamic. And so the first thing I think you tell the developer is that's what it's set up for. Again, I would ask you to talk to the city manager and work through what might be available to you and what procedures might be available. And I'll follow up with the manager to see where we are with respect to the project. But as you do that, understand that if you follow up with the manager will get back with you and with everybody else on the council. Because that's the other thing you ought to tell the developer is you're not just talking to me. I'm not listening to you individually. Any information you give me, I'm going to share with the rest of the council. Okay? Now, there are some occasions where that can't happen. There are some occasions where there are development projects where confidentiality is key to the project. I've been involved in projects, for instance, where Amazon was looking for a new location, and they said it couldn't be discussed publicly, and everybody involved in the discussion, from Michigan Economic Development Corporation staff to county staff to city staff to outside realtors and everybody else, had to sign confidentiality agreements, and your city attorney will work with you through those situations to figure out how to deal with it and how to discuss it. What happens if you believe official statements are inaccurate or incomplete? That the city spokesperson isn't disclosing everything, or the emphasis is on minimizing liability rather than providing public accountability. It advances a particular agenda, whatever it might be. How do you deal with it?
Bring your concerns and issues either to the city manager, I guess it depends on who the spokesperson was. You stated earlier, typically speaking for the council, that's the mayor. Representing the city, normally that's the city manager. So it would depend on who it was, who would you
Right.
talk to, and say, hey, I don't think this, whatever you just laid out there, what your concerns are, and have a dialogue over it.
Right. I would first go to, if it's the manager, go to the manager, have a bit of a dialogue with the manager and say, here are my concerns. If the manager says, oh my, yes, I can see how it could be interpreted that way, let me send out a correcting statement or do some follow-up, or that surely wasn't what I was intended. The next time we send out something, I'll make sure it's more clear, whatever that might be. If you're unsatisfied, then you should talk to the mayor. If the mayor was the origin of the comments, talk to the mayor first, not the manager, because you don't play the manager against the mayor, right? You talk to the person who issued the comments, except if it's a staff member of the police chief or somebody else, you don't go directly to the police chief, you go to the manager. If you're still not satisfied, then have a council discussion about it. Bring it before the council during your council comments and say, you know, I was concerned about the way this was phrased. I'm not sure it accurately represented our position. I'd like us to reconsider or talk about how we're going to deal with this better in the future. Again, you do so in a positive kind of way that elicits a dialogue rather than in a way that makes accusations and imputes motives. Because, again, in my experience, most of the time, people are all trying to work in the best interest of the city, and sometimes they're just not as good at articulating things as they might be, or it was done in a bit of a rush, or it was done by committee, and then the communication gets all goofed up, right? Sure.
So I want to back up to, maybe it's a business or something, or some type of contract being drawn up, and you have to sign the confidentiality. That's more big business, I understand that. So what if it's done at a smaller level?
Well, there should be very few occasions where you have to have real confidentiality in dealing with things. Personnel issues are always confidential issues. There may be a big development project that has to stay confidential for a variety of reasons. But most smaller projects, you know, once they make a zoning application, once they've applied for a building permit, there's nothing confidential at that point. Those are all public documents. Once they've got an application for a tax exemption or tax abatement, that's a public document. So most of those discussions should be public. Now, having said that, my guess is your city manager will, in the course of a year, have a lot of business folks come in and say, I'm thinking about doing X, Y, and Z, and they haven't filed anything, they haven't asked for anything, They may just be saying, and zoning administrators do this all of the time. Somebody comes in, I'm thinking of doing X, Y, and Z. What do you think? Will that fit in this zoning? What should I be aware of? What should I ask the engineer or architect to design or not to design? You know, do I have height limitations? What do I have to worry about? And those kinds of preliminary discussions where there's no ask being made and all somebody's doing is asking for some information or direction, there's no requirement that that be made public.
Is there a timeline when, if I was a business owner and I was proposing and went to city manager, is there a timeline after I propose and ask for this for it to be submitted and discussed?
It depends on what somebody's trying to do. So for an application for rezoning, probably have to have that application and site plans and all supporting materials in 30 days ahead of time, right? To get it on the planning commission agenda, to get it reviewed and so forth. It might even be longer than that. Because there are required public hearings that have to be held and so forth, and 15-day notice requirements for those hearings. For tax abatements, you know, all tax abatements have to be fully approved and into the state tax commission by October 30th of every year. So backing up from that, you've got a district to establish and you've got to approve the application. You've got to hold a public hearing on both. You know, you have to start that process in August generally to get it done by the end of October. So it depends on what somebody's trying to do and what those deadlines are. Again, your city clerk, city attorney, city manager can help with all of those things.
So it never should be a last minute thing.
No, the last minute, businesses that come in last minute and try to get you to break your usual rules and not do things according to the way you usually do things, shouldn't have high expectations at that point, because everybody knows it takes a certain amount of time, there are required hearings, and good process requires sufficient time for review. So on most development projects, you're going to want review by the fire chief to make sure that fire lanes, you're going to want review by the DPW staff to make sure water and sewer are adequate to serve it and that the street system will work and that the construction isn't going to conflict with other construction. You'll want zoning officials to look at it and building officials and so forth. So there may be an entire team of people that have to look at that.
Right, generally by the time it makes it to council for any sort of public vote or something like that, it will have gone through several boards, commissions, other types of, like zoning, EDC.
Right.
Generally it's finishing up by the time it gets to us for sort of official action. Right?
And again, generally before it gets to you for any kind of official action, a city manager who's keeping her finger on the pulse of the community will say, look, we've just had an application put into the zoning administrator or the building official by so-and-so to do X, Y, and Z. That will likely be coming to you in a couple of months. In the meantime, it's got these processes and so forth. So a manager will let you know that that's going on. Again, because you don't want to read about it for the first time in the media or hear about it from a staff member or somebody else. You want to hear about it early on so that when somebody in the community says, I heard, and you can say, oh yeah, I know all about that. We're on top of it, right? Okay, a speaker at a public hearing makes comments on matters outside the scope of the hearing. Sometimes they're not even on the same topic. They get up at a public hearing, you've got a public hearing on a zoning matter, and it's on a particular project, and they're talking about a project 4 years ago that they didn't like the outcome of. Or they're talking about a tax appeal that wasn't granted to them when you've got a zoning hearing. Sometimes it's not even within the city's purview. Somebody will come in and talk about right to life policies. Well, the city doesn't have a lot of control over the policies of the state or federal government on those kinds of issues, nor does the city have control over whether we should normalize relationships with Cuba, right? So generally what I say is, look, tell somebody that their comments are out of order at this public hearing. There's a public comment section at the end of the meeting where they can comment on things not on the agenda. But even then, I would seek to guide somebody and say, look, we appreciate your passion and concern about that, but there isn't much that this city council can do about those kinds of things. They're outside our purview as a city. Finally, a speaker turns to or addresses one or more audience members. What do you do?
Redirect.
Exactly. Please direct your comments to the chair or to the council members as a whole. It's inappropriate for you to address the audience at this point. And rule them out of order, and if they persist, then you'll have some choices at that point. Okay? What questions do you have? Last time I was here, there was a whole list of questions, and I tried to incorporate most of those answers in this presentation. Hopefully, Mayor, I've addressed the question you sent me. Are there other questions?
Mr. Mayor, privilege.
Councilmember Long.
Thank you. As you may or may not know, we have a mayor-manager meeting. Do you consider those meetings with city manager and mayor open to the public? And can it be recorded?
Well, any meeting can be recorded. They are not generally open to the public because it's not a meeting of the public body. And I encourage those kinds of meetings between a mayor and a manager because there ought to be that kind of candid dialogue going back and forth as the mayor serves the function as the kind of liaison between the manager and the council as a whole. So I would think you wouldn't want those meetings recorded because you're going to want some candid dialogue, right? The manager may say, well, where do you think individual council members are on this? And a mayor who's doing a good job as a mayor will say, well, I see council members so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so voting this way. And I see other council members having concerns and maybe not be willing to follow that direction. That's the way I'm counting the votes right now. And the manager may say, well, have you had conversations with individual council members, and do you understand why they have the remaining concerns or why they're choosing to vote the way they are? Because, again, a manager will want to try to shape the agenda item to get approval, right? So if the manager knows that council's disinclined to approve something, either it won't go on the agenda because it's obviously going to be a failed policy initiative, or it will go on the agenda to ask you to disapprove, perhaps, so that a majority can vote and follow the manager's recommendation. Rather than having the manager come forward with something and knowing that a majority of the council is going to be against it. Now, sometimes a manager has to do that, right? On a rezoning application, for example, an applicant has a right to have a council decision on that. Up or down, they have a right for that decision. So it can't get killed by the planning commission. It has to come to council, and council has to take a vote. Yes or no, and that should usually be presented as an affirmative vote to approve the rezoning, and if council decides not to do that, council can decide not to do that. Sometimes it will be presented because the planning commission will recommend against the rezoning, and then it'll be presented that way. But, generally those dialogues ought to occur. They ought to be candid dialogues. They ought to be good dialogues where at times the managers or the mayor's going to say to the manager, you didn't handle that quite appropriately. I think you would have been better to have done X, Y, or Z. Or I heard that you were out speaking to the Lions Club last week and you said it this way. I'm not sure that's where a majority of our council is, and kind of have that candid dialogue. On the other hand, the manager should be free to say to the mayor, I really need your help here. Okay? We don't have any choice but to do this, so I need to get a majority of the council to buy into it. This just is the only way we can get it done, given the limitations of staff and whatever it might be. And you can't have that candid dialogue if others are listening in.
I think we want to get to the point where the relationship between the manager and the mayor, you have some of the same dialogue you described, where the manager is going, Mayor, I think if you'd have done this, it might have gone a little better. If you get to that point, that's very positive.
Yeah, and that happens in a lot of communities. It happens in my community. The manager and the mayor get along very well and have very candid dialogues going back and forth. In fact, sometimes they're rather colorful dialogues. I don't mean that in the way of the language used, but I mean in the way that the manager will sometimes kiddingly say, well, Jack, you can just fire me if you don't like it. And the mayor will say, and I might just do that. But because they've gotten to a point where it's, just kind of, it's a good working relationship. It's like walking into the office of somebody next door, and you have that kind of relationship, right? It's a partnership.
So you were kind enough to provide us with a copy of the charter. And if you would turn to page 9 of 38, and if you could just explain a little bit, expound on section 5.8. Mm-hmm. I think we've got some different interpretations.
Yeah. And those are common charter provisions in a council manager form of government. So if you look in council manager forms of government, while not worded exactly the same way, the same intent is conveyed, sometimes a little more strongly, sometimes a little less strongly, but you still have this intent conveyed. So you obviously can't direct employment or removal of any administrative officer. On the other hand, I have counseled managers in the past. In one community I can think of, particularly within the last year or so, not the one I'm currently in, but there's some concern over a couple of administrative staff members, a couple of department heads. And those concerns council members have it expressed. And the manager says, well, they can't direct me what to do. I said, maybe not, but they can fire you. Right? If your staff isn't working effectively, if your staff isn't effectively representing the city, you can count on that coming through in your evaluation as the city manager, and you can count on being held accountable for having a high quality, high functioning staff. So if they have expressed to you that they perceive some weak links in the staff, you are advised to listen to the counsel you're getting from your city council and find a way to deal with it proactively.
But it would probably cross the line if a council member, mayor, whoever, were to say, you need to get rid of Billy Bob, or he's too much trouble, he's not trustworthy, he needs to go. Would that be inappropriate? Would that violate that provision?
Yes, I think so. On the other hand, I think you can say, I've got some real concerns, these are my real concerns, and so forth. Because the other thing you don't know is what kinds of counseling has already occurred with Billy Bob, where they might be in the personnel process or not, whether Billy Bob is planning to retire in a year or so anyway, whether Billy Bob has some health concerns or something else that may be affecting things. I mean, there may be a lot of things you don't know that the manager knows, and the manager should be sharing with the council as a whole. Now, again, some of those things might get shared or hinted at sometimes in a conversation between a mayor and a manager, so that a manager might say, Mayor, I know the council's concerned. Please let council members know that I'm on top of it, I'm dealing with it, but there are some things you don't know about and I can't share with you, but there are some good reasons why I'm not moving ahead with due speed now to move Billy Bob on.
Okay, so you shared with us the
That's the first
violations of the closed meeting, in your
Right.
opinion, would be malfeasance, misfeasance, misconduct, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
For this violation of the charter, what would that be? You need to get rid of Billy Bob. He needs to go.
Yeah, I think you would rule that comment out of order and say, in the first place, no council member has the authority to give any kind of direction to the manager. It's the council as a whole that gives direction to the manager, right? Council can express some opinions and so forth, and concerns, but you can't tell the manager how to run the day-to-day operations or what personnel decisions to make. And again, I'm assuming if Cullen disagrees with me, he'll flag me down. So, yes.
Can you talk a bit about council members meeting directly with staff members outside of the manager, president, or not?
Yeah. Well, that's the second part of this. So,
Right,
yeah. And so I was going to get to that. I was trying to deal with the two parts, one and then the other. So, I think the manager could say, look, I don't want you to directly contact any department heads or any personnel. If you want to talk with personnel as a council, I'll have the personnel come to the council meeting and we can have a dialogue with those department heads if you want to do that. But generally, it's not working for me to do that. Now, most managers will say, after they get a good rapport with their department heads and so forth, and after they've got a good rapport with the council, they'll say, that's all right, Councilmember Brown, go ahead and contact the DPW director directly if you've got a snow plowing concern, because I probably won't have time to get to it immediately, and the DPW director will. So go ahead and contact him directly if you want to do that. Not all managers do that. A lot of managers, some managers want to maintain that communication because they know what's going on. They know what they're asking the DPW director to do. It's not only plowing snow, but they're working on 3 or 4 bids right now that we need to get out for equipment we need for the summer. They've got a personnel shortage. I've got an arbitration hearing coming up tomorrow I want the DPW director to prepare for. I've got a lot of other things, so I would prefer not having that communication. Or my DPW director is great at the technical skills, not so great with the people skills, so I just soon run the interference, right? And make sure he doesn't get himself in trouble. I want to be the translator between you and that DPW official. Or sometimes it could be, I'm not sure I can trust that person to follow to accurately follow policy. So I want to make sure that if you've got concerns, that I'm directing those concerns directly to that person so that they understand grave those concerns are, right? I mean, there may be a variety of reasons why a manager will say, no, work through me, please. Colin.
So instead, I was hoping to kind of spin off of what Councilman Brown was saying. Something that has come up in the past and may come up in the future is, could you weigh, or I've given my thoughts on this particular subject, but usually would it be fair to say that the one caveat to that is if, for example, department heads have an issue or a complaint
Yes.
or a concern with the manager,
Yes.
they should speak directly to council or someone like myself, the attorney, that is not
Right.
answerable to the manager.
And again, I've had that in the past. I've had a manager who was essentially accused of sexual harassment, and it turned out to be true. And then that comment ought to come directly to the mayor or to you or somebody else and bypass the manager. Generally, it shouldn't come to an individual council member. It would be better going to you or to the mayor to direct that. But yes, if the manager's conduct is in question, then the conversation ought to go right to somebody who oversees the manager. And you have that with sexual harassment or any other kind of harassment. You have that with illegal activity. You have that, I mean, there may be a variety of circumstances where that bypass should occur. Good point, Colin.
Councilmember Law.
Thank you, Mayor. So can you speak to, if I were to micromanage my city manager, how would they report that, or how does that process go for it to stop?
Well, I don't know what micromanagement is a term that is usually in the eye of the beholder. So what one person might call micromanagement, another person might call just holding somebody accountable. So your job is to hold the manager accountable as a body. So how do you go about holding the manager accountable? How would you do that?
Well, can we work through a hypothetical? Because I think that would be pretty relevant. There's a concern by one or two council members that maybe something in the manager's contract isn't being followed.
Mm-hmm.
And they bring that concern to the mayor or to the city attorney. Is it appropriate for the mayor to kind of check in with the manager, saying, hey, we've had some concerns on council about this. Can you help me understand what's going on here?
Sure.
And if they're mayor, okay.
I would expect the mayor to be doing that. If council members, that's the role of the mayor, right? To run that communication back and forth between the council and the...
Simple things like asking about schedule or asking about when are you generally available to talk to in the office? When are you, what are your working hours during the day? When can I reach you? Those are normal conversations you can have with the manager that do not require council action, right? Those are just general questions about the duties that they're doing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, don't miss my turn. Okay. So I agree. Questions. We should all be able to ask questions. I think to expand on Councilmember Williamson's hypothetical, if I, as a council person, contact the city manager and say, you need to submit your schedule every week to council, you need to let council know when you're going to be out of the office, you need to, do these things. Is it appropriate for me as council person to go and say, city manager, these are the things that I'm expecting you to do and provide to council, or is that a council policy making opportunity?
Generally, that's something where the council ought to set those expectations as a council. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. Because different communities work it differently, and different managers have different ways of working through that. So I already explained that most managers send a weekly memo. That weekly memo tells not only what's gone on in the last week or last couple of weeks, but what the manager sees as upcoming, generally shares something about the meetings or significant events that the manager has attended over the last week or so, and what's upcoming. And if the manager expects to be out of the office, attending a conference, attending a meeting, or whatever, generally that's shared in that weekly memo as well. Again, because council's role here is to hold the manager accountable and to understand what the manager is doing and going through. You can't understand what's going on or or how much work is being done on your behalf unless the manager shares a little bit about what's going on. So you have those weekly memos. Some managers share their past and upcoming calendar info. They'll actually copy their calendar and just attach that to the memo so that council can see what's going on. Some councils ask for periodic updates on key priorities or programs. So in one community, the manager on a monthly basis said these were the council priorities for the year. Here's the progress that's been made in the last month on those priorities. I've attended X, Y, and Z meetings. Staff has met on this issue. We've got a working draft here, whatever it might be. Sometimes you look for it in reported absences. So most managers report either to the HR director or the clerk when they're using personal leave time, when they're using sick time, when they're using a floating holiday, whatever that might be. It gets reported so that it's properly accounted for on the payroll. If there's comp time that they're using, they're accounting for that as well. Go ahead.
Okay, what happened, because, you probably don't know, but I asked for those things from the manager, because the manager before, it helped me out, it helped me to keep online as to what we were doing and how far we had gotten into when the next meeting was or something of that sort. And I was just blasted right out of the water because I asked to, could you please submit to us, a form telling us what we have done, what we are going to be doing, say like a week ahead of time.
Yeah.
And could we have one of those at each meeting telling us, just like you're saying, what's going
Right,
on?
and you don't need it in great, don't need it in great detail, but it would be nice to have, just some bullet points. Here's what's going on. Here's what you can expect to happen, or some highlights, kind of thing, right? And go ahead.
Next thing, what do you do when you ask for a meeting with the manager, and it's almost like you're ignored because you wait for 45 minutes and then they walk in and say, "Oh, you're still here." How do you handle that without just getting really upset about it? And then the next thing is when citizens complain to their council person about asking for a meeting with the manager and they're told, "I don't have time." So they call me. But you don't have time for me either, so what do you do?
Let me just suggest some other ways you can hold a manager accountable, and ultimately, you don't have to have a reason to fire a manager, right? So, just like my city council doesn't have to have a reason to fire me. It can fire me anytime for any reason, no reason, because they don't like the tie I wear. It doesn't matter. I work at their pleasure. a manager ought to be keeping you reasonably informed as to what's going on, what activities are occurring. It's not unreasonable to ask, when are you normally in the office? What does your normal day look like? Those are good kinds of questions to ask, okay? Most managers I deal with, you'll find managers in the office at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning and often doesn't leave till 6 o'clock at night. Sometimes you get pleasant surprises, and we've had councils that have told managers you're working way too much, right? We don't want that. I've also had situations where managers kind of walk in at 9:30, 10 o'clock, and they're in the bar at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that can be problematic. So asking those kinds of questions, not that I'm trying to keep tabs on you, but if I were trying to call you, when would I normally expect you there? If I'm directing a citizen to you, what would be a good time for somebody to try to contact you? Or when would be a poor time to kind of try to contact you?
Would you need to get a vote by council to ask that question?
I think that those are kinds of things that a council ought to sit here and say, look, this would be really helpful to me. Now, I say that because I've also had council members try to direct a manager in terms of an agenda. So I had a situation where I had a city commission, and one commissioner sat and said, I want way more information for the agenda. I want you to attach all of this stuff every time there's a bid. I want to see the bid tabs. I want to see the raw bids. And another council member saying, no, you're giving me double the information I want now. I want that packet to be that thick, not that thick, right? And then the council can't agree, and the council as a whole needs to give some direction, because otherwise, how does a manager respond? So you need to make sure that the requests being made are consistent with what all council wants to know. On the other hand, if a council member wants to know what hours the manager's usually in, that's a pretty reasonable request, and the rest of council ought to say, that seems like a reasonable request to make. Why would I try to stand in the way of that?
Preset 9:30 meeting, and you walk in at 10:15.
Well, sometimes there's a reason for that. I worked with a number of years with one deputy city manager, and I always said that's on, and I'll use a fictional name, that we're working on John time. He's never to a meeting more than at least 10 minutes late, right? So it became a running joke. Everybody knew that because he was always running from meeting to meeting to meeting and having a hard time. It's like the doctor's office, Once the first meeting runs 10 minutes over, you never catch up the rest of the day.
So, I guess the question I would like to ask is, in your experience, when there's new members to any team,
Yes.
Can you say
accountability is a key point to any team, whether it be the city manager or whoever. What have you seen in your experience? Is it a functional accountability team, and how they make sure that things run smoothly when hiccups come during the process? So you don't have all this.
Well, if the council has differing concepts of what should be expected of the manager, the council ought to get together and try to say, what do we minimally expect? Now, a manager ought to be accountable for the days and times that they're taking off in accordance with their contract or personnel policies, right? If it allows you to take holidays and it allows you to take paid time off and so forth, you ought to be accountable for that. A manager ought to be accountable for being able to demonstrate that in the normal course of a week
they put in a full week's worth of work, at least a full week's worth of work, right? So you ought to have an expectation as a group that the manager's going to perform at that kind of level. Now, some weeks it might be 35-hour weeks, and some weeks it might be 85-hour weeks. You know, during the snowstorm, there were a lot of managers working very hard. I know in some small communities, managers were out driving snowplows, so or running snow blowers so that the guys with the CDL licenses could drive the plows. You know, that kind of accountability, asking a manager to follow your personnel policies and practices in those kinds of ways is important. If you have practices for travel and other expenses, asking the manager to account for those things is certainly appropriate and important, and you can ask for that accounting and accountability. If you ought to be able to glean from the manager what kinds of meetings have been attended and what kinds of positions he or she have taken at those meetings. You ought to be able to glean what staff's doing on a regular basis and how priorities are getting addressed and so forth. And that kind of communication ought to be forthcoming. A new manager generally goes into the process, like a new city attorney goes into the process, trying to earn the trust, right? So I go overboard in my communication. I go overboard in my communication with my city manager in this case, because he generally is the point of contact between me and the council, but I want to make sure the manager, and in his absence, the assistant city manager, is never left to hear something that from somebody else that I knew about and didn't relay. So if I have a conversation with somebody who's mad about this, or a developer who's going to do that, or somebody who's threatening, I want to make sure the manager, and in turn, he puts it in his weekly memo so the council's aware of what's going on. If I'm going to be out of the office, I let the manager know that I'm planning to be out of the office, and I turn in timesheets, the manager does too, on a bi-weekly basis as to when we're in and out of the office, what days we've taken, if we're taking days off, whether it's paid time off or a floating holiday or comp time or whatever it might be. So those are just normal kinds of things you would expect in the operation of the community, and the normal kinds of accountability patterns that people would have to earn the trust.
And so just as a general rule of thumb, for those normal kinds of things, normally it's laid out in the employment contract that says this is what you're authorized to do, here's your requirements, here's what you need to do. And so to remind the city manager, whether it's an individual council member or the mayor during one of these weekly meetings that we have, that, hey, this is what the contract says, you need to do that. Nothing wrong with that.
No.
Okay. Councilmember Lawler.
Thank you, Mayor. So, in a mayor's scenario, would it be beneficial to say, for the mayor to say, hey, I got people concerned about what the city manager is doing, so, just letting the council know that I'll be expecting the next city manager to turn this in, or reschedule, things like that, just to keep us updated.
Sure. So a mayor might say, for example, I've had conversations with a few council members who have raised some concerns, and I've shared those concerns with the city manager, waiting for the city manager to get back to me in response to those shared concerns and how they're going to be addressed.
I would think, based on our earlier discussion, that the mayor or an individual council member, if they had a concern that things weren't being done properly, would talk to the manager first before making a public issue at a council meeting.
Sure.
And if that didn't resolve it, then I could see where you would have to go to the council.
Right. Or an individual council member who's talked with the manager might say, Mr. Mayor, I talked to the manager and this happened, or Mr. Mayor, I had a meeting scheduled with the manager came in 45 minutes late, no apology, just looked at me and said, oh, you're still here? that would be something for you to know and to be able to discuss with the manager. You might say, you know, that council member seemed a little bit taken aback by that. You might want to contact that council member and address that situation. I know you've explained to me you were in the middle of an emergency, you know, we had a snowplow accident or something that you were trying to address, and but you might just contact that council member and follow up.
So it might be a little strange that if you had a meeting, say at 9 in the morning, and at, well, say maybe 3 o'clock that same afternoon, there's a special council meeting called by council members that are concerned that you're micromanaging the manager because you asked them to turn in their leave slips or turn in their receipts. That might be a little odd. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I thank you for your time. I really do. I thank you for coming down and going over the roles and what council manager form of government looks like. So I think that I've heard some interesting things this night. And rather than beat a dead horse, I think moving forward, it's important for us as a council to recognize what needs to be a council policy decision versus giving an individual directive. I think there was some fuzziness about that before, but I think moving forward, I think with your PowerPoint, and maybe if you could give, I think you've done a great job though. There's a huge difference between, how can I say this and be positive? There's a difference between giving a directive, telling someone, telling administration or a city manager when you come to a meeting with them. If it's more of a one-way communication, that may be problematic for the weekly meetings. And I think that was, from what I was told, because I didn't attend, I think that was a lot of the concern. Those meetings were structured in a way where you were sitting down and you were having a discussion, but it was more of a one-way discussion. This needs to go. I mean, there was an agenda brought into the meeting, and it was that so much of a dialogue as it should have been, is the way it was conveyed to me. So I think moving forward, if we could encourage those meetings, more of a two-way communication, more of a dialogue, more of the things that you talked about, you know, well, I think council's position on this may be this way, and, whatever way that the mayor can, advise the city manager, and vice versa. But I think it's important to be solution-based and figure out what we need to address and what we need to do better from this point on.
And certainly that's the case. If you're talking about council priorities and you're saying, a council priority is that we improve the streets and we identified certain streets that we want you to do, can you enlighten me as to what you're doing to meet that goal? On the other hand, if you've got laid out expectations, there's no reason you can't tell the manager that, look, our personnel policies require X, Y, and Z, and I see where you've met those personnel policies. Your contract requires, our budgeting process requires that we have a public hearing on the budget by May 15th of every year. Where are you in terms of your scheduling for that public hearing?
Right.
How are we going to meet that? And so to hold any employee whether it's the manager or the manager holding somebody else accountable for very specifically laid out requirements, there's nothing wrong with that. In the way you would do that with everybody. And I would expect my council or manager to look at me and say, you've got to turn in a timesheet every week, right?
Right.
Petty cash, you have to fill out this form to get the petty cash. You don't just go up there and expect somebody's gonna hand you $20 and you're not accountable for it later, right? And whatever that might be, if there are certain other requirements. I'm supposed to attend all of the council meetings unless I've been previously excused from attending those meetings. And if I didn't attend, I would expect the mayor or manager to look at me and say, why weren't you there?
Correct.
Right? If I was rude with a city citizen, I would expect to be held accountable for that rudeness or discourtesy. On the other hand, if they're saying, well, one of our goals is to address recreational marijuana, and we've kind of given you direction, we want to go this route in addressing it, when are you going to have the ordinance available for us, a draft of the ordinance available for us to look at? That's more of a dialogue, right? So I would agree with you that where you're looking at policy kinds of things, it ought to be kind of a dialogue where there are set expectations already. Holding someone accountable for those set expectations is perfectly appropriate with the manager, just as it would be with any employee.
And as you observed, you weren't there for the meeting. Councilmember Lawler was. There were 10 or 12 items on the agenda, and she happened to arrive when we were on the last agenda item. So I don't know what you were told. Yes, Councilmember Reed.
I don't know how you function, but if you were the mayor and was going to have a meeting with the manager, was going to have a meeting with the mayor, do you think it would be necessary to have the people there to see to it that the law had a meeting?
Our council rules state that. Our council rules state that.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Mayor and Council, I think it's important to know, to recognize that Attorney Smith is here to kind of highlight the way that you can create a productive relationship between a council manager form of government, and I just want you to stay on topic because we're all aware that there are issues with current employees that are now on leave, and I don't think you need to belabor those points tonight because it's being dealt with.
But should that happen again where a council member wanted to sit in on that, should that happen?
I'm just saying what I think you need to focus on tonight is how to work together with as a group and with your administration and look forward rather than what's happened in the past.
And looking forward, what I would say is first talk with your city attorney because there may be reasons for including them or not including them.
Focused it right back on me.
But generally in personnel matters, if you've got strong personnel concerns and you think there's serious kinds of concerns, my general rule of thumb is whether it's an HR person dealing with someone, whether it's a city manager dealing with a subordinate, police chief dealing with a subordinate, I generally say it's best to have two people there, right? So you don't get a he said, she said kind of thing, and you have somebody there. It's also a good thing to have two people there because then sometimes the second person will pick up on cues or things that one person misses and can diffuse situations and other kinds of things. So sometimes it's helpful. But no, I don't think it's helpful generally in those kinds of conversations to have a whole group of people because then it feels like you're being held up. So that's just general personnel advice regardless of who you're dealing with.
Councilmember Lawler.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. I wanted to address the hypothetical number 5. A public comment includes personal attacks. So when our mayor hits the gavel and notifies the person that they are out of line, out of order, at what point can even if they call point of order on a council member, at what point can that person be removed? Or how does that go? Do we have to decide as a council that somebody has to be removed, or can the mayor just say, Scott, can you remove this person?
Well, I know of a couple of recent incidents where things like that have happened. I alluded before about the situation where the students came in and did a demonstration and all laid down on the floor and refused to move and so forth. In that case, the mayor said, I'm adjourning the meeting, and just gavelled it adjourned. Why? Because he didn't want the specter of having to forcibly remove a bunch of students. That's the kind of thing they were trying to provoke, and he didn't want to have them get that win, nor did he want to try to have to yell over them or that kind of thing. So I thought they were far enough into the agenda that it was easy to do that anyway. You also probably read the news reports recently about the Kent County Board of Commissioners and the demonstrators that were coming in to demonstrate against the jails policy with respect to ICE detentions. And in that case, the city commission adjourned the meeting. The next meeting, they kept the public out of the room in which the meeting was occurring and allowed them to attend only by video and so forth, and got sued over it, and they've since changed that policy. My view, and Colin and I have talked about this a little bit, is that you don't want to give folks that are grandstanding in that kind of way, where they can't control their temper in that kind of way, you don't want to give them what they're trying to provoke, right? So you should, at all reasonable means, avoid that. Sometimes adjourning the meeting is the only way to do it. Sometimes you may say, okay, we're going to take a 10-minute recess, and it will allow people to cool off and get recalibrated. It will allow a private conversation between the chair and that citizen, or the chair and that council member. It will allow a private conversation between the police chief or somebody else and that person, or other members of the audience. I've also seen somebody get up and get very agitated and profane, and the poor person's spouse is sitting back there wanting to crawl under the seat. And so by recessing, people can collect themselves. So you kind of need to act in the circumstance, but I would try to avoid the kind of specter where you're removing somebody. Obviously, if they're getting violent and threatening members of the audience or threatening council members, you don't have any choice but to try to maintain that. And I had a situation at a village council meeting once where somebody in the audience came up and grabbed the microphone away from the village president and took over the meeting and started ranting and raving and so forth, and the armed deputy in the back just went like this, and it quelled things real quickly. But you have to work within the circumstances and use good judgment.
Rule 7B specifically addresses that question of, can the mayor do that if needed? Yes.
The previous mayor asked about that. So.
Are there any other questions from the council?
Colin, anything that?
No, I'm just glad I could spend a meeting with the healer where he was all on you, not on me. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Attorney Smith. Okay. Last item on the agenda for discussion and approval, reassignment of acting city manager duties to Chief Kip. May I have a motion?
So moved.
Seconded?
Second.
Thank you. Discussion. Mr. Mead, we've had a discussion, and if you would enlighten us all.
Sure. I guess the first thing I'm going to say is thank you all for putting your trust in me and giving me the opportunity. I've enjoyed it. I like a lot of aspects of doing this job. It's been challenging, but in a good way, in a fun way. I've enjoyed it a lot. The big concerns I have, and there are a couple. Keep in mind, we do have the vacant deputy or DPW director position. So when you step into this position of the city manager, you're kind of directly or indirectly also taking on a lot of issues that are occurring in, I shouldn't say issues occurring, you're taking on a lot of the duties that you would normally have to be addressed by the DPW director as well. So you're kind of putting on two hats instead of just the one. And as I had mentioned when we started this, I said, you know, we could give it a run for a couple weeks because we are at year end. We are at tax settlement season with the county, which, by the way, I got the letter. We got to be settled with them March 13th. That's only a couple weeks away. I'm almost embarrassed to say we haven't even looked at that since December 31st, so we're way behind on that. And we have an audit coming right after that on the tails of the tax settlement. So a very, very busy time for our department of finance, a lot going on, and we're getting further and further behind. I'm getting further and further behind. The staff's doing a great job trying to stay ahead or keep the day-to-day things going, but there's a lot of critical deadlines coming up in finance, and I'm getting way behind on them, and I got to focus on those. They're too important, obviously, the audit and settlement with the counties and stuff. It's stuff we've got to address, but again, I do thank everyone here has been very, very supportive, and it's been uplifting to have your support and work with you, and I've been appreciated very much.
Comments by council members?
I have a question. My question is, so we would be putting Chief Kip as acting manager. So this isn't an interim basis. This is. Could Colin? Could you just clarify that for us, please?
So I've had some discussions with individual council members, but what I would suggest is the status of the manager position right now should remain an acting manager, not an interior manager. I don't think you should, assuming you make that transition, should not happen until action, whatever action that's going to be, with the current manager's contract occurs at the first regular meeting in March. So anytime after that point, I think, depending on which way the council goes, you can look to that interim position. But right now, what you're looking for is an acting manager just to steer the ship until you get into March.
That's exactly the clarification I was looking for. Thank you.
Councilmember Spicer.
I have a question for Director Mead. I know that the city manager position that you're doing, I don't know if it's taking 90% of your time or 100. And so I just wondered if it could take up 50% and then the other 50 could go to another staff member. Is that something that we could consider? Because I guess I'm just wondering. I don't know.
It's tough to answer that. Here's what I run into a lot in the finance department. The projects we work on, particularly some of the larger things where you really get involved in spreadsheets and deep numbers, and they take a large chunk of time, and it's not easy as I'm sure, it's never easy to be interrupted a lot, but sometimes you can shift gears pretty easy. But when you get into a lot of these, trying to settle with the taxes, for example, where you've got columns and columns and columns of numbers and everything, and you get interrupted, get a phone call, and then you can't remember where you left off, and you just run into a lot of difficulties trying to do some of these tasks, when you're trying to bounce back and forth between 3 or 4, different duties. And what I kind of told myself in the last few weeks is, you know, I would have days where I mean, literally there are days when you were asking the percent of time, I mean, some days there are DPW guys or something maybe lined up on my door when I get in the morning, and it's one thing, you know, phone call, email, someone coming in all day long, and I think, oh, okay, that was a busy day. Tomorrow I'll focus more on taxes, for example, or something. And the next day, tomorrow comes, and it's more of the same. And I'm starting to see that with everything going on in the city, which a lot of that, to some degree, that's a good thing. I mean, we've got a lot of stuff that's coming up with some grants and projects coming, and we're wrapping up some grant work and stuff. And as you guys are aware, the street projects coming up and stuff. So it's good to have all that, but it does entail a lot of time. I don't know. I think it would be tough to do it with the short deadline I have right now for the tax settlement and the audit. I think right now it'd be best if I get to devote 100% of my time to that. But I appreciate the question for the thinking outside the box. If that answered your question.
Yeah, I guess it does. That's what you. Thank you. Yes.
One of the things that you share with me, if I understood correctly, is that normal staffing, normal routine, you have a deputy treasurer that's been involved in the financial aspect of it and working side by side with you. And even though that position is currently filled, events because of the election being only happens so often, that individual hasn't had the opportunity to work with you in that detail, so it makes it that much more difficult to delegate things to do that. And that's part of why we had that discussion about how is this working.
And I guess, you know, we even talked some about, you know, the possibility of bringing in, you know, maybe a CPA firm or something to help. And I think there probably are circumstances when that may work. We're probably at a point right now where we're getting down to the wire where by the time you got them in here, because, you know, they may have a little bit of a lag time before, you know, they probably couldn't show them tomorrow. You know, they probably got a little bit of planning they would have to do by the time they get in and then get set up and get familiar with our system and find out where we're at. I'm just worried we'd be pushing it on some of the deadlines. I'm not saying I couldn't entertain ideas down the road.
Down the road, great.
And then I believe we have a resolution in place that talks, Colin, about the order of succession.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the way that the resolution reads right now is it says when in terms of the acting manager, and that's drafted pursuant to an ordinance, it says when the manager's not able to act or not present, finance director, in this case Tom Mead, is the acting manager. In the event that Tom is basically not here, then it falls to the public safety director, Scott Kipp. Our resolution doesn't go beyond that. Now, I've had conversations with other council members that, you know, given that this is the second time that this has come up, knock on wood, in the last few years, hopefully it won't happen again, but, I mean, maybe down the road we come up with a more levels to our succession plan. I guess no one ever really contemplated that statistically how likely are we to get to that third level and not have a public services director and not have a manager and not have, it's just one of those rarities where all 9 plans lined up and we got hit with everything at the same time. So the way that it falls right now is it's supposed to go manager, finance, public safety, and it stops there.
Councilmember Brown.
Thank you. So, Attorney Harkness, can you speak a little about the ordinance that's in place? One that I'll share. I talked to Attorney Harkness last night. One of the questions I had was the way that the resolution that you referenced lays out the order. I asked you well, ultimately, this is a council decision, whether or not to us reassign the acting city manager duties to Chief Kip. But we talked about other options, and you mentioned an ordinance.
So, well, the ordinance that I'm referencing is, so there's an ordinance that's 2-58 that basically says, it's entitled Acting City Manager. It says the city council may appoint or designate an acting city manager during the period of vacancy in the office or during the absence of the manager from the city for more than 5 days and shall fix his compensation. Acting manager shall have all the authority and responsibilities as the regular manager, and the acting manager will not be an elected city officer. So what the council did, and forgive me, I don't have it in front of me, I want to say it was 2013 or 2014, they did a resolution. I think it was 2014 because it was when Manager Mitchell was here, because there was previously a different order. It used to be, it went public services and then public safety. Manager Mitchell changed it to the finance department and then public safety. You know, and so that's what you have in place right now. I mean, the one thing that I'll offer to the council, because I've been through this particular scenario more times than I'd like to admit, is what you're looking for is someone, and I use the analogy to steer the ship until you can make a decision on an interim manager, whether that's going to be an in-house candidate or whether you go to MML and get a temporary manager. But what I would offer is, and my advice to you is, now is probably not the time to experiment with who might be able to do the job, rather than who do you know can do it and can keep things on track while the city's going through this difficult period with all the different personnel issues and all the other operations that are going on. So, but right now, what you have is set up with Tom and then Scott. Hypothetically, you can designate any city employee that you want. What I told Councilwoman Brown is, ideally, you'll identify one of the directors, because they're the top individuals in terms of the city administration. Traditionally, as long as I've been with the city, which is the better part of a decade, it's always been, your acting manager's always either been your public services director, your public safety director, or your finance director, because those three individuals basically oversee 90% of the operations in the city. They're the ones that are the best equipped to run the city. Right now, you don't have a public services director. Right now, your finance director is telling you he's about ready to pull his hair out because he's doing way too much. So, but you can designate any employee, but what I told Councilman Brown is I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to designate a subordinate to fill that role from an experience standpoint, and from a logistical standpoint, it's probably not a matter of good personnel policy to take a subordinate employee and temporarily promote him. I think it's just going to cause issues. So, but that's just my 2 cents and my recommendation.
Councilmember Reed.
No problem with Chief Kip. He's done it before, and did a good job. So I see no sense in trying to pick up somebody else to do it.
So unless, Councilmember Brown, do you have comment?
Well, you can go first.
Well, I went, so you go.
I have to? Oh.
Councilmember Williamson.
Okay. I was just going to say, so we had a very limited amount of time to maybe talk to people in our precinct about how they felt about this, because it kind of popped up late. However, I did call a phone tree of people to talk about it. People are looking in our community for some stability and some measured action. And I think that we are kind of at a breaking point on our council and what we're doing, that if we make any major decision not to follow what we've done in the past, that is going to continue to erode the public trust in this body. And so, and I got that from every single person I talked to. And it was a very diverse group. I think that it was pretty representative of at least my precinct and some of the community here. So I want to speak in strong support of Scott Kipp. Ever since I've seen this stuff and paid attention to this stuff as an adult in the community, he's been the guy who's always kind of like stepped in and, like, you know, he was that steady I got your back for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or whatever this council has ever needed. And so, and I want to continue to reaffirm the faith in our directors of our city and their skills and abilities. I really thank Tom Mead for coming forward and being honest. It's really hard to be honest with your employer about things that are hard and tough and what's not going to get done. And so that's incredibly brave. I don't think I'm going to tell my boss tomorrow I can't get something done, but thank you for that. And I think we should you know, give the community what it is so desperately seeking from this council, and just allow for the orderly transition as we go forward. So thank you.
So, any last comments?
Yeah. Thank you. So it was kind of quick. And I will say I respect your comments, Councilmember Williamson, regarding your input from your constituents. I will also say that sometimes the public is not privy to all information that we are as council. And I will ask you all to keep in mind closed session conversations that have occurred since January 22nd up until now. I know in my conversation with Attorney Harkness, we identified the director positions, and there are 2 people out there. John Tracy is one, and Jill Domingo is another person who could step into the acting city manager role. I can't remember who said it, but just to keep us afloat and get us to wherever we're going in the near future. So I'll end my comments with that, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay, I think everybody's had ample time to comment. Let's have a vote. Please call the roll.
Councilmember Reed,
Yes. What are we going to?
We are voting on reassigning the acting city manager duties and responsibilities to Chief Scott Skip.
Councilmember Reed,
Yes.
Brown,
No.
Lawler,
No.
Spicer,
No.
Williamson,
Yes.
Clark,
Yes.
and Mayor Atchison.
Yes. I believe that. Thank you. Okay.
Good.
All right. If any council member wants to bring something up for future agenda items, we just did that 2 days ago, but please feel free. That's the next on the agenda, future agenda items. I think we already covered that earlier in the week. Okay, public comments. If we have public comments this evening, at the end here, please come forward, state your name and address. Keep it to 3 minutes, and I ask everybody in the gallery to respect the speaker.
Garrett Brown, 1016 South Superior Street. I want to commend Attorney Scott Smith for the excellent job that he did, and he always has done. He was a really a source of just experience and wealth of knowledge when it came to drafting the council rules. And so, you know, just as an ex-mayor and a resident, I wanted to thank him for the excellent presentation, and also wanted to thank him for highlighting the fact that, which is the understanding that I have, is that when it comes to FOIA responses, you have public devices, you have personal devices, you have public business and personal business. And the only one of that grid of interactions, which is probably exempt from FOIA, probably is private business on a private device. So I appreciate that because that's been a concern. I don't know if you can respond in public comment. I think one of the things that also I think would be helpful to the council to know is some discussion of the proper relationship between council and the various boards, because I know that comes up a lot and can be a source of tension and some misunderstanding. So those are my 2 comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Are there any other public comments this evening? If not, do you have a report this evening? You just gave one. Okay. All right. Mayor and council member comments. If there's a council member that wishes to make a comment, Councilmember Williamson.
I do, and this comment is because I'm very close with people who are hearing impaired in the community. It is imperative that we as council members, when we are talking, that we have these microphones right in front of our faces, and that we are speaking directly into the microphone. I don't know if any of you watched the playback on the YouTubes, but the sound quality is quite poor, and you have to listen to it on high, even if you have regular hearing. So if you are of a certain age where you have lost some of your hearing, or if you are a person who suffers with a hearing impairment, it is very difficult to hear people with especially low tones and low frequency of their voice level. And there are several people in the community who do watch this and expect to be able to hear us. And so I just want to make sure that going forward we kind of keep that in mind as we do this. I could tell tonight with the placement of the microphones that when I check YouTube tomorrow, much of some of the comments that took place during the training are not going to be heard. And so, so just keep that in mind going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? My comments are thank you very much, Attorney Smith. That was very enlightening, very helpful. Appreciate you did an outstanding job. I will mention that you have many fans that highly recommended you, and I commend you for that. And Mr. Mead, I can't thank you enough for spending 5 weeks working through this. It's been a real joy and pleasure working with you and talking with you, and I appreciate it very, very much. And if I can have a motion to adjourn.
Support.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of adjourn, say yes.
Yes.
We are adjourned. Thank you all.